Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. All right, Ben, so today's episode is an episode that is, I don't know if I'd say near and dear to our heart, but definitely something we've been marinating in for years. What are we going to talk about today?
So today we're going to tackle the topic of military veterans and civilian work, hidden issues and potential solutions. And, I think this is an episode that's relevant particularly to those people who are in the military or veterans who are looking for civilian work, but it's also relevant to everyone else because there are, many veterans that come out of the military that are looking for work. Many of you may work with them and so forth. So I think this is really an episode for everyone. And as you mentioned, Chris, you and I have some credibility on this topic, given that, we've both been around the military now for, between the two of us, many decades, and have seen the complicated nature of transitioning from being in the military to working in a civilian environment. And we'd like to talk about some things today that I think are really important for both veterans and civilian employers. So we're going to talk about a handful of these hidden issues. So what are some things we're going to talk about today?
Okay, so we're going to talk about having an unrealistic transition preview. And, hey, I'm going to pop out of the Army or, the Navy or whatever and just transition right into a role, right? And sometimes it's that way. Sometimes it's not. And so We'll talk about that. Geographic and flexibility. We'll talk about danger, a sense of entitlement. And we'll talk about a knowledge and skills gap, as well as additional tips and ideas for both transitioning veterans and employers who want to hire them.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think some of these topics are things that, as we discussed when we were preparing for this episode, these are things that some of them are, only a veteran can kind of say some of these things because we're not going to take it easy necessarily on veterans themselves either.
I mean, we totally kick bears. It's part of our daily life.
That's right. That's right. So why don't we start with this first one, which is this idea of the unrealistic transition preview. And before we get started, I do want to mention that, some of these ideas are also articulated in a blog post that I put out a couple years ago now, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And this blog post got a lot of traction out there in the interwebs, so you can check that out. But this first one is this unrealistic transition preview. So what's the problem here?
Well, it's kind of, if you're in the Guard or Reserves or, that's, the weekend warrior, as some people call it, or M-Day, as, maybe people in the know would call it.
Or active duty.
Yeah, well, if you're active duty, right, transitioning, if you show up, the Army's giving you a job, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be, go clean that motor pool or go lead these soldiers or whatever. And then after a while, if you don't screw up too bad, at least at the beginning, you get a promotion, right? And so you're just assigned your job. And it keeps going. If you're denied a promotion, you're still staying working till your contract is out, right? Mm-hmm. As long as you don't, walk pantsless across the sergeant major's lawn. Heck, you might even survive that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you can survive that, but probably not popping positive on a drug test. Right?
You got it. So anyway, you're just assigned your job. But when you come out into the civilian world, there's no job assignment board or something. Right. You actually got to go duke it out with other people that want those same roles.
That's right. And, for me, so I was active duty Navy for a number of years, and then I went into the reserves. And so I really, I went through this transition from active duty employment to trying to get a civilian job. And I just remember, in those first few years, or even before I even was commissioned as an officer, this idea that, hey, you're going to be a surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy, and you're going to get all this great experience leading people and teams and stuff, and that's all true. But what people also said is, employers are just going to, be falling all over themselves to hire you, and they're going to automatically understand what you did and all this kind of stuff. And then, I was getting out, and I was just like, this is really, really hard. There's so much stuff that I didn't even know that I didn't know, and
what year was this, Ben?
So that would have been in 2005, 2006 timeframe. Yeah. So it was rough. And,
right before our big little crash thing that we had, right?
Yeah, right before the economy tanked too. And so, it's really important, so there's decades of research on this idea of having a realistic job preview. So knowing what you're getting into with any kind of role in a job and so forth, kind of knowing what it involves, warts and all. And I think the same thing is true of this military to civilian employment leap. So I want to be extremely clear here and try to speak directly to people who are in the military, who are thinking about, their future, because everybody does get out of the military at some point, right? So, thinking about this employment leap that you're going to have to make, you've got to be realistic about it and understand that it's going to be hard work. It's going to be, tough. It's going to be an emotional roller coaster. There's a lot of stuff that you just don't know.
Yeah, and you don't have a civilian work identity yet, right?
Right.
Like, Ben, what were some of the lame jobs you took in your transition?
Oh gosh, this is gonna make me start crying. So I had so I got desperate, and when I first left active duty, and because I was, and we'll talk about this later, but I was geographically constrained for a variety of reasons. I kind of went through the process of looking for civilian work through some headhunters and so forth, and we can talk more about them because I think they actually do a really good thing in a lot of ways. But once you become geographically constrained, it's very hard to work with a headhunter or an executive recruiter, whatever you want to call them, because of how they operate, right? So I was geographically constrained, and I was getting kind of desperate. It had been a couple months since I had gotten out, which now looking back, I'm like, there's no reason why I should have been desperate at that point, right? It was so silly. It wasn't like I was, desperate to pay the rent. My wife had a job, and so I took this is awful. I took a job with a bottled water company where I was trying to sell water coolers, and it's just total cold calling. You go into businesses and hey, y'all don't have a water cooler. You want one? It was horrid. And
no offense to the legions of excellent water cooler salespeople.
Oh, sure, and that's a good point. For me, it was a personality mismatch. I didn't know what I was getting into. The region that I was assigned was already, kind of unbeknownst to me, completely saturated by a competitor, and it was just
We'll put the military person on it. He'll charge that hill.
Right. I think that's kind of what they thought. And, so I did that for, I slogged it. I was doing 300 calls a week. I was really hitting the pavement and getting out there, and it wasn't going so
great.
Good.
So we should get you on that for a consulting firm, Ben. I think you only did 200 calls last week.
That's right. And so, so after a while, I realized this wasn't going to work out, and I left that and eventually got into another job as a writer and an editor for a university, which actually was a really cool job. Got to work with a lot of really cool people, but I was definitely underemployed at that point. I was making a lot less money than I actually was on active duty. And that kind of triggered my transition into graduate school and so forth and so on. So it was not easy for me. And I know that this kind of story is similar to what a lot of other people go through.
Yeah. So, and don't get me wrong. There's a bias towards that it's going to be easy and awesome because some people do land easy and awesome, right?
Sure, and more power to them. That's awesome.
Yeah, if you're General Petraeus, you're a known quantity. You're going to get a book deal. And, even if you leave in scandal, you're at that level. You're landing, you're like Sean Spicer. you're going to land on your feet somewhere, right?
Even if it's on Dancing with the Stars, right?
Is that where he went?
He did a stint on there.
Gosh.
Yeah,
well, there you go. General Petraeus, you're missing out, sir. You got this whole... Anyway, so, but I knew lots of guys when we were deployed. I mean, heck, some of these guys didn't even have college degrees. They're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to get a 6-figure contracting job, which, I mean, for a while, there was enough demand that some of those numbskulls got it, you know. But I remember talking so I only joined and was in the Guard. So I actually compacted all my training into a year. So a whole year I was gone pretty much, knocking out, you know. I came from an active duty family, so don't you dare show up at your platoon untrained. So I did basic training. I had like a 3 or 4 day week break or whatever. Then I went straight to officer candidate school. Then we had like a couple little days of break, and then they had this thing called BOLIC 2, and then infantry officer course, right? So I was gone a long time. So I got to see people on the active side. You know, I trained with them down at Fort Benning, Georgia, and you know, they would talk about civilian world, right? Because some of those guys hadn't really been, you know, they'd been enlisted, and then they, you know, for maybe 10 years, then decided to go to OCS or something like that.
Right.
And then you'd pop out to your units and stuff, and people, you know, there would be Guard members that were active, and they'd talk about transitioning. And I gotta say, their concept of what civilian work life looked like was just off.
Yep. Yeah. So there's this, I think it's fairly pervasive, this unrealistic transition preview. And part of it's just our natural human optimism, which is a good thing. But I think you also need to be realistic about it. So let's talk about what are some potential solutions to this problem of unrealistic transition preview? What can some of these people do to help mitigate that?
All right. So, and actually I have these conversations, oddly, with these retiring colonels. You know, they're like, oh, what should I do? I was having a conversation last month with a guy who's retiring HR personnel. He's made his career in HR, but he hasn't picked up some key things. So you got to start planning for this post-military life. Because, you know, if you sign up at 20, you're retiring at like 40, 45, you still got a lot of years of work left in you. That will be fulfilling. I mean, unless you just love golf that much. So right. Day one, you got to start thinking about that. So one of the things is the types of degrees you get. So if you use your GI Bill to go get a degree, you know, some of these guys are just like, hey, I can get the promotion points if I have a degree. So I'm going to get, you know, Sumerian pottery, you know, undergrad, and like a basket weaving master's or something. Well, would be a really interesting career path. I mean, I don't know what do you want to do with that. No offense to the Sumerian pottery experts out there.
Right.
But you got to get a degree that has a narrative, because your civilian employer is going to sit and say, well, cool, tell us about your life. And they can tell, and you're just checking the box, or if your degrees have nothing related to what you're doing.
And I think along those lines, and so this, I just do want to disclose my bias as a professor at a brick and mortar institution, but I think that there's ample evidence to suggest that military people and really everybody, but military people in particular, I think get preyed upon a little bit by some of these for-profit online universities.
Oh, they do,
and
it's horrible,
and they end up getting, you know, they use up all their GI Bill, or they even maybe get into debt, and they end up with a degree that was, you know, maybe it even has a decent title, you know, but they maybe didn't learn anything. These are not necessarily the highest quality types of degrees, and even if they are right now in the marketplace, I mean, there's enough like people. Maybe I'm just being kind of curmudgeon-y, but you know, enough people who have a bias against that type of degree that it's a tricky thing. So be very careful when you're choosing not only your degree but also the institution from which you're going to earn that degree.
Right. So and this is just the brutal reality. You could be unfortunate situationally positioned because, oh, well, I'm in Germany and then I'm in Korea. So you may want to do an online program. If you do,
right,
the quality matters. And so, like, if you're in a super, super busy part of your career, yeah, and you can't dedicate the time to get the grades and that kind of stuff, be careful with that, right?
Yeah. And there are good online programs out there, and there are many reputable institutions that offer them. So just do your homework on this stuff.
They got minimum barrier. They got to be accredited, right? Yeah. And I think there was some legislation around making sure GI Bill could only be used at accredited things. I can't remember where that fleshed out. But also a brick and mortar, we'll go on this side tangent a little bit. A big part of your education is rubbing elbows with fellow students.
Right. And for those of you who are in the military, this actually ties into another point that can help mitigate this unrealistic transition preview, which is staying connected with civilian life. Because you imagine, if you're in the military for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, during that time, all of your civilian peers have been interacting with each other, learning things about their jobs and so forth. And to the degree that you can, stay connected with the civilian world while you're in the military, even if you're on active duty. And I get it that this is hard. This can be very hard because sometimes, military life can be rather all encompassing, especially if you're posted at some, you poor people in the Army get stuck in some weird places sometimes. And, so, you may be in the middle of nowhere at some base and all of your friends are Army. And I get it. Like, that's hard. But to the degree that you can, try to stay connected with civilian life. Stay connected with your family, your friends, and get out there in the community so you can have an idea and continue to build that network while you're in. And all of this has to start not weeks, not months before you're intending on getting out, but years.
Yeah, I mean, there's still hope for you if you're just starting late in the game. So don't be a bummer on that one. But thanks, Ben. Guess what? You haven't done any of this. You're host.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
So, but if you can I know I did my graduate program, and Ben, I believe your graduate program that you teach in has classes in the evening. That is something you can do, because if you're, say, a young enlisted person or something like that, and you're getting your undergraduate while you're still in the military, even if you move once in your degree and have to transfer credits, which is a pain, by the way, but you're building a portfolio of professors that know you, especially if you kind of see them outside of class. You're writing them emails and say, oh, I remember Ben. Ben was, tracking on this stuff. He gave a rip. That starts to build your portfolio of people in the civilian world that can vouch for who you are.
That's right. And you mentioned something that I think is important to note too. You said transferring credits. So this is a lot easier if the institution from which you're earning your degree has an accreditation, right? So
if it's not accredited, just don't do it. I'm just going to tell you, if you've already started down that path, start over. It'll be so challenging.
Yeah. So great. Another thing in terms of some advice for people who are thinking about leaving the military is that, depending on your situation, don't do it.
Oh
Stay
my God.
in.
You got four kids and a dog.
Right. I mean, oftentimes it's natural to kind of think like the grass is always greener. Maybe we have some civilian friends who are doing really well and so forth, and that's great. But depending on your situation, maybe don't get out. It could make a lot of sense to stick around in the military and, stick it out to 20 years or whatever, so that you can have, that stability during those critical points in your life, especially if you have, as you mentioned, have a family and so forth. And I think this is, I don't know if this is particularly applicable to officers, but, people that I'm around a lot, oftentimes, think that they're going to get out and make more money. I know a lot of officers who get out and they make significantly less money, at least for the first couple years while they're kind of playing catch up in the civilian world. So, the grass isn't always greener.
Yeah. So I was working on setting up this was for a large organization. They wanted a civilian recruitment path or a military recruitment path. And so we're setting up training. We're going to do a cohort approach, all this kind of stuff. And I remember going and talking to somebody. I'm not going to dime this person out, but somebody that was pretty senior in the Tennessee Guard about setting up this program. And he's like, well, actually, I'm retiring soon. Throws me his resume. I kind of review it with him. I put him into an interview scenario saying, hey, listen, this guy's pretty senior, is coming out. Would you like to talk to him? And it came back that this guy didn't even know the basics of his stuff, right? Some of these guys, at least, I mean, it's not everywhere, right? But just like anybody that's a civilian world knows a senior leader that probably shouldn't be there. Or, right. Somehow they have a political situation or they're really good at painting their pig a pretty color, but they're just bad, right? They don't know.
Right.
And so when you're coming out as a senior person, if you don't really know, your technical, if you know how to repair Apache helicopters, okay, great. You could probably hop right on in. But if you've just been at that kind of, I'm a very important person. I manage 2 people or whatever, or even some of these colonels, I manage 600 people, but everything's served hot and ready and they just rubber stamp everything. Mm-hmm. This guy was horrible. And I've run into so many colonels, right? I mean, these people are right. They've been looked at for general a couple times. General super competitive has actually a civilian political element as they have to get rubber stamped by some civilian political people, Congress people, whatever. I don't even know what it is. I just know there's some stamp there, right? Mm-hmm. But so these aren't like your junior people, and lots of times they're numbskulls, right? And so if you're coming out, I mean, hey, I've got my civilian hat on. I've seen you guys in interviews. You stink compared to your civilian counterpart, right? So if you don't have those a realistic transition preview, some solutions, you're like one of these guys has got to go get some HR designations because he doesn't know how many employees you need to have before you, by law, have to get a breastfeeding room. There's that's just not something that they've been exposed to, right? So you don't have to stay in forever, but if you don't have a good transition plan, don't get out yet. Right.
Right. I think that's definitely something to consider. And, another thing that you can do, I think, to help with this unrealistic transition preview is along the way, develop good relationships and mentoring relationships with civilians, right? So kind of as part of staying connected with civilian life, you can look to build and maintain good relationships with civilians who have successful careers, be they family or friends or other people you've crossed paths with along the way. And this can at least help you kind of stay abreast of what careers might look like when you if and when you choose to leave military service. So there are a number of organizations out there that kind of can help to set up these mentoring types of relationships, but I think that that's an important thing. And then I think the last potential solution with regard to unrealistic transition preview is just as a military member, manage your own expectations. Sometimes just simply embracing that reality or the notion that this is going to be hard is helpful, because if you set that kind of expectation, that standard, hey, it's better to be pleasantly surprised than to be just crushed.
Yeah. And let me mention this one thing that this was the first time I've seen this, and this was absolutely brilliant. I knew this colonel was going to do well. Before she got out, she reached out to some of her soldiers. Now, she was a full-time guard person. She reached out to some of her soldiers and said, hey, listen, could I come job shadow you?
Wow.
So she went to several of these guys, and this is in the technology field, so IT stuff. So she spent several days with different people that had pretty senior roles at these companies, just shadowing them. I mean, they went to HR and said, hey, can this person come shadow and see what this looked like? And HR was like, sure, fine.
Yeah.
And so she
No, that's
she
really
learned
cool.
how civilians conducted meetings, right? I mean, these you wouldn't even think this would be a challenge. Like, oh, this is how meetings go. Oh, this is how project management works. This is how kind of the whole psychosocial element happens. She's going to land on her feet. And she did. She interviewed and got a job before she got out. But when she's coming into those civilian environments, it's not like, this is the first time, you know.
Right, and one vehicle for people who are on active duty to get this experience, or maybe set up these kind of relationships with people who know stuff about the civilian world, is, hey, make friends with the people who are in the reserve and the guard who you may be around, because some, not all, but many of them may have really cool civilian careers and know some stuff that, guess what, you don't about the civilian world. Develop those relationships because you have the military connection already with them. You may work with them in some capacity on the military side, and they can be a resource for you in terms of getting your kind of orientation and getting some building some expectations and so forth, just knowing what you're getting into on the civilian side.
Yeah, knowing how to dress. You know, like it's, you know, the first time you go job shadow somebody or whatever, yeah, definitely wear a suit, right? And a tie or whatever that equivalent is on the female side.
And you know what? For all you dudes out there, please make sure that your shoes match your belt. Just pet peeve.
I mean, the uniform in the military already makes sure that your shoes match your belt, but that's something you have to do on your own civilian side, right?
You can do it.
And this is something where you can just, and you'll know because you'll get a glimpse at how the organization is, and then you'll be able to dial that in. But okay, let's talk about geographic inflexibility.
Sure. Yeah. So geographic inflexibility is tricky when you're looking for a job because guess what? Employers aren't tailoring their job to your desired location. Like they have needs in certain areas. And this is particularly true if you are working with an executive search firm, a group of headhunters, and there are a number of these big firms that have a division or a group that specializes in transitioning military personnel. So for example, Lucas Group is one of them. I've actually had really positive experiences with Lucas Group, even though I didn't end up getting placed in a job through them because of my geographic inflexibility. Orion is another. There's a handful out there. And they actually do some really good work, I think, because they can help to open the doors for transitioning military members into jobs that they would have no clue even existed, right? So I remember I got through a bunch of interviews with Stryker Medical to do medical device sales. This is like a long time ago. Ended up not going to Kalamazoo, Michigan. I needed to be in Charlotte, North Carolina, so couldn't take that job, but it opens doors. But this idea of geographic inflexibility can be really tricky for you if you're working with an executive recruiter, a headhunter, or if you're just looking for work. If you're, I am only going to take a job in this little town, well, that's going to limit your options.
Yeah. So let me just bifurcate or split that open a little bit, right? So if you are a senior person and you can lock down an executive role, all that transition stuff before becomes 10 times more important. Lucas Group and some of those other guys generally place with companies that are pretty good at onboarding somebody within a military background, right? And putting them in these kind of clutch roles. Same thing if you're able, if you want to go back and, I was in the Alabama Guard for like 7 years, okay? And some of those guys just wanted to stay in a small town. Like, so, they have like Talladega, Alabama will only have certain amounts of jobs. Right. And so you would need to calibrate your salary expectations stuff on what is available. That being said, if you want to like supercharge your earning or have a big career path, having that flexibility to go someplace else is clutch. Now, let's say you're in a bigger place. Let's put you in a place like Atlanta, Nashville, the Research Triangle, Raleigh-Durham area. you're going to have a lot more options depending on industry there. So if you're in tech and you're in one of those big towns, you can be kind of geographically fixed, but there has to be enough companies in that town. And, for our civilian listeners, you're probably saying, wait a minute, it's like, hey, in the military, we don't know that. We just say, move out to Germany, Roger that, see you there in 3 months, and the Army packs up our stuff and then we're there doing a job in someplace else. Right. So, if you're in tech or something, there's got to be enough stuff for you to make that transition. Now, because lots of companies vary in whether or not they can promote within that. So, like, Allegis Group, Tech Systems, these are some of those firms that do really well keeping somebody in one place. So, and this wasn't on our notes, Ben, but let me just mention a couple more things about working with recruiters. Get a variety of recruiters. So if you're Lucas Group, they're going to place you all over the place, right? Because they get those executive placements, they're not as common as Yale .NET Developer 2 roles, right? Or HR Professional 3 type role. So you got to have that flexibility. If you don't have that flexibility, the bigger town that you can be near is the better, right? So if you're in Nashville, make relationships with several recruiters. Now, and here's why. So, if you want to maybe 1 or 2 large recruiters and then maybe 2 or 3 small mid-size recruiters. One of the things is if you get placed by one of these guys, but see another role elsewhere, that recruiter that helped you get that role can't poach you, right? They generally have an agreement with that company that they don't try to hire off their own placements, right? Because they're getting some bucks. Every paycheck you get, they get a paycheck too, and kind of scenario, right? So, but those smaller guys, they can totally place you if they have a place. And those smaller mid-sized guys may be more hungry to place you someplace because, they need every dollar they get super counts, right? So you want to build that relationship with some of those recruiters, go hit a home run on some of your first placements, and they will help you navigate your career. So anyway.
Great. Right. And so, if you can be open to that employment anywhere, another thing that you can do is if you are more geographically constrained, you've got to be even more strategic and more focused in your networking efforts. Right. So, get involved in that community, the civilian community, not, you can't just be in your own little military ecosystem. You've got to branch out. Ways that you can do that, right? Could be through various nonprofits you're involved in. Maybe you can join a board, even just join the local, rugby team or whatever. All these kinds of things can give you exposure to other people with whom you may not otherwise be exposed. And all these things can then help you to build your knowledge about what might be possible.
Yeah, and then so network is generally kind of a little skeezy, right? Because it's like, let's be friends so you can help me get a job, right? Like that's such yucky.
That's like superficial bad networking.
Right. So real networking is do stuff that you enjoy. So if you love rugby, join the rugby team. You will have a blast. You will meet friends you legitimately like having beers with. Maintain connections with them through email, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever. How's it going? Look, I got stationed in North Carolina. By the way, the rugby's really sweet over here, Then when it comes time for you to retire, you have this portfolio of legitimate, meaningful relationships where they actually know you and who you are. And they're like, yeah, man, there's this role at my company that would be banging. Hey, I've known this guy. We played rugby back in the day, rather than here's a transitioning veteran that really needs some help. Can you, it just doesn't sound so good.
Yeah. I mean, and it's nice to help the transitioning veteran for sure. Keep doing that, all you civilian people, for sure. But I think it's this networking from a place of genuine connection and not just trying to manipulate other people into helping you is the way to go. Another way that you can do this is if you're in a military specialty that has some sort of civilian corollary, like my area, HR or IT or something like that, supply chain, these types of things. There are all kinds of amazing professional organizations on the civilian side that you could join. And one of the best ways to network there is not just like running around and like shaking everybody's hand, but actually by getting involved in that organization and, joining their board or volunteering for a position, because then people are going to get to know you. They're going to get to see you do something, take responsibility for some aspect of that organization. And if you do a good job with it, that's going to reflect well on yourself, and they're going to be more likely to endorse you and help you with potential needs that you may have down the road.
Yeah. So like in Nashville, we had different, people would host conferences. Buddy Gaines started a developer conference that would happen every year, and it got bigger and bigger. But you can volunteer to help organize some of those conferences. There's a .NET developers group in a lot of towns. Same thing with Java. If you're meeting software developers, and they'll generally have somebody. A typical format for these meetings is somebody will come speak on a topic, and then everybody sits around and has like pizza and maybe a beer or something. Lots of times these recruitment firms will host those kinds of events because they want to keep tabs on talent of who's looking, right? This is a great time for you to start, meeting people, also getting professional designations that are meaningful in your field. So, one common thing I see a lot of veterans say, like, oh, yeah, I've experience with project management. Well, yeah, you got a lot of stuff done, but project management is actually a formalized body of knowledge, documented in the PMBOK. That's a project manager's book of knowledge. And then there's like agile stuff. You got to learn those actual formalized stuff so you can speak the right language and you can manage projects the way civilian people manage projects.
Right. And one way to demonstrate that to civilian employers is through having your PMP certification, right? So it's kind of the project management thing. If you're in, my world of HR, there are two different kind of credentialing organizations that you can look into for getting different certifications. All of that can certainly kind of build your street cred as not just a high performing military member, but also someone who has some knowledge of what's going on in the civilian world.
Right, and you can talk. So when you sit down to an interview, it's like, oh, well, you're not saying, well, I had my first platoon at the age of 24, and then I became a company command. I mean, they don't know what that means. But if you said, I've always had an interest in human resources. So one of the things that the military helped me do was get my college degree. I got my college degree in human resources. Then I did the following jobs. I managed these types of projects. I then got my master's and continued that journey in like industrial and organizational psychology. I mean, now you're starting to sound like a civilian, right? Rather than, I was 18 and like, I didn't know what to do with my life, which who knows when they're 18, really? I mean, so I joined the Army and then I know it's pretty great. They told me what to do and anything they put in front of me, I did a really good job at, which is, those are totally fine. Like I know guys like that, freaking great. It's just not as compelling as having this arching narrative. And you could even have it change. So you can say, I really thought I was going to do this. I joined the military. I got my degree in this because it made sense. But then, maybe you wanted to be an infantry officer when you started. But then I was really, as I was exposed to the work environment, I decided human resources was the way to go. So I got my master's in that. And then I started transitioning. Pete, those narratives make sense. They happen in the civilian world, but you got to be able to paint those narratives to a civilian employer.
Right. And when you're talking with a civilian employer, don't talk in that goofy voice that you just used, right, Chris?
Yeah. I don't know what is that. I don't know what that was.
Not gonna work here.
Yeah. You just it has to make sense, the things you did. And if you're involved in these, if you're going to some civilian night classes, if you're involved, now this is your spouse is probably going to want to stab you for it, but you're like, hey, I want to take 2 days of our vacation time a year to go to a professional conference in another town, right? You may have to pay for that out of pocket and all that kind of stuff. So education, conferences, maybe you're sitting on the board of the local Salvation Army. I don't know what it is, right? When you go to talk to a, civilian interview, you're not going to be like, okay, well, so what did you do these years? I did the following task. Roger that. You're going to drop that militaries, right? And you'll be able to flow in a civilian way and then make a meaningful connection during those interviews.
Right. That's right. So we've talked about this idea of unrealistic transition preview. We've talked about, this idea of geographic inflexibility as being some issues that can really be harmful for your ability to transition out of the military. And the next one that I want to talk about is one that I think is kind of this one that really takes, a military member or a veteran to kind of say to our fellow veterans and military members. And that's, you got to get rid of any kind of sense of entitlement that you may have about, how deserving you are of civilian employment.
Yeah. We've come a long way as a society, and I think we're getting kind of calibrated on a civilian view of the military, right? In the sense of, you may have a different political persuasion than what the military's doing at that given time, but we're not stoning soldiers, some of which, signed up out of a legitimate patriotism. As like, we need a military, right?
No, absolutely.
And
right.
I think we're calibrated in our view. But that being said, just because maybe a civilian picks up your tab at the local Cracker Barrel or whatever, that doesn't mean that you're floating on. You're not better than your civilian counterparts.
That's right. And I mean, I don't want to overemphasize this point and say that, all military members feel this way, but it's something that I've noticed a couple of times that I think can really get in your way of making this successful transition. And as you kind of alluded to, I mean, I am very grateful for the progress we've made in American society in terms of how the civilian world views military members. I would not have wanted to be in the military, during the Vietnam War. I mean, that would have been really hard. And I think that the way we treated military members and veterans at that point was totally disgraceful. And things are much better now. But at the same time, as a military member, you need to realize that nobody owes you a civilian job unless you can provide them with some sort of value to their organization. That's just reality.
Yeah. So, you took a job with a employment contract and a duty description and everything when you signed up. Now you're just transitioning from one company, the military, right, to another company. And they just have different cultures, different norms. And so nobody owes you anything. With that being said, with these other items, like, you've got a great skill set, right? You've had awesome experience, lots of times, more in-depth experience than your civilian counterpart has in certain types of activities. Great. Parlay that as a strength, but you still got to do some other stuff to make this stuff happen.
Right. And so, some solutions, I think, with regard to this issue of a sense of entitlement, first of all, as you are transitioning into civilian employment, you've got to remember to, stay humble, stay hungry. You do have some wonderful transferable skills. In the military, many of us have the opportunity to gain leadership and management experience way before our civilian counterparts, which is great. Teamwork skills, problem solving, other stuff like that. But we also do have some stuff to learn. And, don't be arrogant. No one likes it. Be humble, be ready to learn. And another thing is, get some help with your resume too. There's a lot of great people out there, good organizations that can help with this whole aspect of transitioning from the military. But, get some civilians or people who know what they're doing to look at it and say, you need to rephrase this so it's not a bunch of jargon, right? You need to be able to talk about what you did in a way that makes sense to someone who may not have a military background.
Why should we hire you? Well, I'm a colonel. And what does that offer us? Well, I'm a colonel. I mean, right? That doesn't work. Nobody cares.
No.
Honestly.
Yeah. Well, and even if they do, I think approaching it with that mentality is probably helpful. Don't assume that people know anything about your military service or what it even means. They don't know a whole lot, perhaps, about rank structure and so forth. They may even have misconceptions about kind of, what the military is even about. So, be humble, get out there, learn, and find ways to speak about what you did and what you can offer in a way that makes sense to the civilian side.
Yeah. So let's talk about knowledge and skills gap and what that looks like.
Right. So, this is kind of related to the ideas we just talked about, but part of the problem when you're making this transition from being in the military to working in the civilian environment is that, there's stuff that you just don't know. You have some great transferable skills and so forth, but, as a military veteran, that doesn't automatically make you God's gift to corporate America. It doesn't teach
you're a diamond in the rough, guys.
Exactly. And I think thinking about yourself that way is really helpful. Military service, for example, doesn't teach you the fundamentals of, civilian accounting and finance and marketing or entrepreneurship. Even a lot within the HR world is different in the civilian environment than it is in the military for sure. Learning things about, so for example, you may have a bunch of experience in managing people, but do you really know a whole bunch about, civilian HR law or hiring practices and talent management and all that kind of stuff? Probably not. And so realize that there might be some skills that you need to brush up on and really start to delve into. And, we all have, military members have done, are very accustomed to going through training. Just treat this as another training opportunity that you're going to dig your teeth into and learn as much as you can about the civilian world.
Right. And, some of these organizations, they tend to be larger ones. They actually have a veterans transition program. So they all right, we know how to take you numbskulls and turn you into civvies, right? And that could be super helpful, right? They'll have maybe a couple classes on navigating the civilian environment, blah, blah, blah. The civilian environment's not that much different. You just need maybe a couple of conversations to help dial you in.
Yeah. And, in addition to that, you might be able to seek some educational opportunities that are out there. They could be certificate programs or leadership development programs that are happening at various educational institutions. And also, look for those employers that do have a history of dealing well with veterans. So, there are a number of organizations out there that, kind of rate organizations in terms of how veteran friendly they are. That can be a helpful way to decide, where you might be a better fit. Some organizations, especially larger ones, have a dedicated person or even a department to helping transitioning veterans, which is, I think, just fantastic. But that could be another way for you to kind of focus your job search and have a better probability of success in that job.
Right. And get a civilian mentor. Somebody can just call and be like, what the heck was this? Or, email etiquette is one of the obtuse things about civilian culture that, why can't you just say what you mean? Well, there's some of these items there, but, if you've been doing your role planning, so when I exit the military after 20 years, because you guys should stay, recruitment rah there, but or transition to the guard, those kinds of items. But if you've started from the beginning with a good plan, you've had exposure to the civilian side all along the way. You've picked up some mentors, people you can ask all along the way. You've been going to conferences, so you're plugged into a community of practice and thought around, your desired industry or, skill, that you're a software developer or something all along the way. This stuff becomes super easy. Matter of fact, you kind of cruise in for as close to cruising in for a smooth landing as possible. Get those designations. I know some kernels right now that would be killer, but they can't even get past the stupid, everybody does this. They have these, you go online, you fill out an application, and they have some kind of algorithm that says anybody that doesn't have the SHRM HR designation or the PMP designation, you don't even get a look at, right? And sometimes that's because they have like 1,000 applications and they need something to just whittle it down to 10, right? So get those, get those professional certifications as you're starting to wrap up, or at some point keep them alive if you get them mid-career, right? Which means some continuing education credits and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's going to be super, super helpful for you.
Right. And by the way, getting those certifications and so forth while you're in the military may actually help you with your military job. So that's kind of a cool thing too. You may learn some things that would be helpful for you. Awesome. So we've talked about these 4, what we call these hidden issues and some potential solutions for them. These ideas of unrealistic transition preview, geographic inflexibility, a sense of entitlement, this knowledge and skills gap. But there's another kind of group of things, and these are just kind of additional things, tips and ideas that we have come across in our experience or from working with other people for both transitioning veterans and for employers who want to hire them. So let's talk about some of those, starting with the veterans. What are some additional tips and ideas that we should share with our listeners?
Yes, guys, you got to have cash, right? Don't, you got a big truck payment and you've been blowing it out at Disney World with the family every year and you have no cash. Stay in the military for a little bit. Build up some cash, because that's going to give you, to use the military term, freedom of maneuver. You can maybe be a little bit pickier about that first role that you take out of your military career into the civilian life. Cash will reduce that stress.
Yeah. So while you're on active duty, don't go out there and get your, an expensive vehicle that you're going to have a whole bunch of payments on, right? Get the used vehicle and take some of your money and sock it away so that you can be ready and have a cushion when you're actually making that leap.
Right. So, as you transition out and you haven't done some of these things, take a coding camp or something that will allow you to network and let people know right away. One of the things I recommend doing is, rather than just sending your stuff to a recruiter, ask to have lunch or take that recruiter out to lunch. Now, generally, those recruiters actually have a budget, so they'll probably pick up your lunch. But let them meet you so they can see that, you can zip up your pants and put your shoes on the right feet, right? It goes, because if somebody's just a digital resume, that doesn't give a sense of who you are. So when you're there, smile. Let them see some of your personality. Meet them in a way like you're going on a good date, right? Let them get a sense of who you are, because lots of times there's tons of people that meet that baseline requisite skill capability, but that personality and who you are is what really takes it to the next level. That's also, they're safe people to practice that kind of networking interview kind of thing.
Right. So for organizations that are seeking to hire veterans, I think there's a number of key implications and things that they should be thinking about. And the first one is that, veterans can, and they often do, really have some awesome, valuable, transferable skills. In the military, you oftentimes have the opportunity to be in a leadership or a management role very early on. The military has some really great ways to approach things like planning, things like driving projects to completion, accomplishing a mission. All these kinds of things are actually really, really useful and can be amazing assets for you as an organization. So if you're not an organization that has really thought a lot about looking at transitioning veterans as a potential pipeline for talent, give it some thought, because they really can offer a lot to your organization. So that's one thing that I think organizations that are seeking to hire veterans should be thinking about.
So if you've got a big corporate organization where 30% of them just stir the soup every day and don't get anything accomplished, maybe not the best place for a veteran who's a hard charger. All right. Because they're going to be like, why the heck is nothing getting done around here? Well, you come with me. We're going to finish this. Right. And that's going to be a total culture mismatch. Right.
Yeah. But it could be good for you if that's what you really need.
Go find one of those lazy 06s. They can sit there and stir the soup for you.
Perhaps. I think it's also important for organizations to realize that the military population is not this just one type of person. There is still a lot of variance within the veteran community in terms of personality, in terms of knowledge, skills, abilities, all those other characteristics, like any group of people. And so, as an organization, don't just assume that they're all going to be robots, and thinking in one way and so forth. Do your normal process that you would do for any good hiring type of procedure. So, still go through that type of process when you're vetting who you're going to hire.
Yeah. So, and I don't know, this one's a challenge. I thought about bringing this up, but I'm just going to do it, right? Don't ask them weird questions about the war or deployments. I've been asked, did you kill anybody over there? Why would you ask that? Just there's just certain things you don't go and ask somebody a new hire at a company and be like, oh, so are you more a boxers or briefs kind of person? I mean, it's somebody look at you like, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Don't ask people those weird questions. There's not a socially scripted answer. And just conversations about a whole host of things that don't belong in the workplace. Those are questions that, in my view, at least, that don't belong there.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can, but at the same time, I don't think you need to be scared as a civilian employer, as a civilian, to, ask about, some basics of their military experiences. Say, so when and where have you served? What kinds of stuff did you do? I think that's totally fine. And many military people, appreciate that and like to share some of the cool things they've done. Many of us have been around the world and done really cool things. And asking about that is totally fine and probably even a really great way to build that relationship.
Yeah, and if you traveled around the world and done a bunch of stuff, you kind of don't have anything else to talk about but traveling around the world and doing a bunch of stuff, right? So
right, yeah. And the other thing is, organizations that are seeking to hire veterans don't assume that. Don't ask them whether or not they've killed people and stuff, but also just don't assume that all military members are broken toys that are suffering from PTSD who have, been in combat for the last decade. Now, some of them may be, but that is actually a very small percentage of military members. So, these are people who, have done cool stuff in their lives and their careers and deserve a shot in the civilian environment.
Right. And, we're just like everybody else. Here's another thing that I want to say, and this is kind of a thing that's kind of unique to being in a Guard that, since this is a kind of our grab bag of practical tips. If you're in college, right, and you're thinking, what am I going to do? If you're a hard charger that really wants to move up the executive ranks or that kind of things, here's a route, people say, well, tell me what to do. Now, you don't have to do it. There's a million ways to skin the potato of life, so to speak, but I don't know what that means. But anyway, one of the things that I recommend and that was super helpful is, and this is totally a recruitment, ploy here, but join the Guard or reserves, right? Mm-hmm. So while you're in college, you're learning stuff. I mean, my first job was managing 40 people in an infantry platoon, right? Now, how senior do you got to be in organizations on the civilian side to manage 40 people? Right?
That's going to take you years.
And so when you come out of college, you're generally an individual contributor. You're just going to be doing some tasks and you got to get some technical competency in those tasks. Meanwhile, 1 weekend a month, you're practicing leadership skills for 40, 60 people, right? Or even a smaller team, 8, 10 people. You'll make those mistakes in the lab of life, but that's fine. Military does a good job of cushioning you and helping you out and be successful with training and coaching and support. So when it comes time for you to hit that manager role, you've been out of undergrad for a few years. Maybe this is before you pick up an MBA or something. You get put in a management role, and you're generally kind of in a cohort, right? Maybe 4 other people get, promoted to manager at the same time. While they're struggling to figure that out, you've had like 6, 7 years practicing, right? I mean, this is just my kind of prescription for life for people that, want to go this route. But so you look awesome compared to your peers because you have more years of experience doing that kind of stuff like, running a plan, completing projects, communicating what you're doing, all those kinds of things. That's such a cool, unique way to do. Not only do you get to help your country out and do really cool stuff and build other skill sets, it also helps you accelerate what you're doing on the civilian side with your career there.
That's right. And I would echo the recruitment message here. I served on active duty and then I went into the reserve, and it's been almost 18 years of service as an officer by this point. Most of that has been in the reserve, and it hasn't been easy at every point, but it by and large has been a phenomenal addition to my life professionally and personally. Made lifelong friends, got a podcast co-host out of it. Those types of things are really amazing. And, like you said, you get to develop all these amazing skills, get to perhaps travel. And, along the way, you get to serve and wear the uniform and support a country that is the best country that has ever existed on planet Earth. So, to me, that is very motivating, and I love it. So I hope that we've shared some good insights here for both military veterans who are looking to get out, as all of them will at some point. If you're in the military, you will need to make that transition at some point, as well as perhaps some insights that are helpful for organizations that are trying to look to hire some military veterans.
Yeah, thanks for listening today, guys.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.